So, today we may actually be living more intensely with the consequences of the things that we say, our words, and also our actions. But I think that's in part because so much of that gets recorded now on Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, even on YouTube. And while sometimes expressing an opinion about a political or social issue does get you death threats, thank goodness that is still not a usual occurrence. So, when we hear that Jesus' neighbors were so enraged by his comments after the first sermon that's recorded in his hometown, that they were ready to hustle him out of town and throw him off a cliff, it might be important for us to understand what was going on there. There are so many times that I long to know more than the Gospels tell us. Luke said, and this you heard last week, that in his first sermon, he opened the scroll of Isaiah, and he read from it. And it's, of course, they didn't have chapters and verses in Jesus' time, but it was toward the end of the scroll, chapter 61. Good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed, words of hope and deliverance. That's what Jesus read. Although it's interesting that Luke misquotes Isaiah, because Isaiah says nothing about sight for the blind. And then Jesus says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And all we know about the rest of Jesus' message is that his words were gracious. What did he say? We don't know. What we know is that the depth and the authority of his comments so amazed the people who listened to him that they said, how could this blossom have grown in our own local soil? It reminds me of a story. There were some tourists doing the European travel, and it seemed as though in every little village they stopped in, there was a placard that said someone famous was born in this town. So they came to one little hamlet in the mountains, and they asked a local man, was anybody famous born here? He thought for a moment, and he said, nope, only babies. The people of Nazareth ask, in response to Jesus' first sermon, could this message be from somebody who grew up in our village? We remember the day he was born. We remember when he started to walk and talk. He's just one of us. But Jesus hears what's buried in their comments. He hears the possessiveness, he's just one of us, and he hears the dismissiveness of what they're saying. And for sure, Jesus does not want to be labeled, local boy makes good. And in fact, he doesn't base his ministry in his hometown. He says here, his ministry was based in Capernaum. And then, Jesus reminds his neighbors that sometimes God bypasses the hometown folks and does his very best work with complete outsiders. He only refers to 2 incidents, but they were stories that everybody in the synagogue would have known because they were stories of the history of the Israelite people. So, I love to do Bible study, and I'm going to ask you to see if you remember the stories that Jesus is referring to here. If you need Bibles, the first story of the widow of Zarephath is in 1 Kings 17, if you want to refer to that. But what I'll ask is, in that reference, is there anything about that story that you remember from confirmation or Sunday school or even seminary? Anything about that story? You know who Elijah is. Elijah, the great prophet of Israel. And we know lots of Elijah's stories, and in fact, Jesus was often considered to be Elijah returned from the dead. Okay, anything about that story we can share? We'll tell it together. Yes?
Didn't he come and ask her for food and she didn't have any?
Absolutely. Okay, and I'll repeat that. Elijah has found this widow. She's actually gathering sticks to make a little fire. And there's been a drought that's just beginning in the land. And in fact, it's a drought that Elijah announced, part of his conflict with King Ahab. And he says to her, "Give me a little bit of bread and water." And she says, "I'm sorry, I don't have anything." And in fact, what did she have left? Do you remember that part of the story? She said, "I only have these 2 things. Enough food for her and her son." And it was a little bit of meal and a little bit of oil, right? So she could mix that up and heat it. She said to make some cakes. Now, we're not talking about Betty Crocker, but some bread. And my son and I will eat that, and then we will die, because there's nothing else. And Elijah said, "As long as I'm with you, the meal and the oil will not run out." And he stayed with her for the whole time of the drought. And Jesus says, 3.5 years. Okay. Now, we've told the story. The significant part of what Jesus is saying is that it was in Sidon, which is outside of Israel. And Elijah had gone there to escape from Ahab. He and King Ahab didn't get along very well, and that's putting it mildly. And there are other stories about that. But Elijah was getting out of town and getting out of Israel. So the woman that he helped was an outsider. And Jesus says, there were lots of widows in Israel, right? Elijah didn't go to them. He went to a foreigner. Okay, that's the first story. The second story is in 2 Kings 5. And it's the story of Naaman the leper. Does anybody just give us a clue about what's going on in that story? Okay, this is not an Elijah story. This is an Elisha story. So this is after Elijah's time, but his successor, Elisha, who was also a mighty prophet. Naaman was the commander of an enemy army. And our story says he had leprosy. We have a picture of what that is, Hansen's disease, which is horrible and leads to death. But there were lots of skin diseases that were called leprosy. So we think Naaman did not have the skin-eating leprosy, but another skin disease. And Naaman, as part of being an enemy of Israel, has conquered various parts of Israel. And in one of his raids, he takes a young Israelite girl and she becomes a slave in his household. And so while she's doing the daily caring and seeing the effects of this skin disease on this great commander, she says, you know, there's a prophet in Israel who could help you with that. And so Naaman goes to his king and says, is it okay if I go to Israel and ask for a cure? And the king says, that would be fine. You do that. And by the way, bring along a goodly amount of payment. And there's silver and there's clothes and there are lots of valuable things that Naaman brings with him. He doesn't go to Elisha, to the prophet. He does what happens actually in our synod. If you want to approach someone, a pastor, let's say, in another synod, to do work for you, you don't do that directly. I can't go to another synod and say, Pastor, would you do interim work for us in Central Southern Illinois? Oh, no. That would not be a good thing. That communication happens between the bishops, right? They talk to each other, so they continue their good relations with each other, and we're not stealing people across borders. Well, that's what happened in this story. Naaman's king sent Naaman to the king of Israel with all these gifts and said, I present my commander to you. Can you please cure him? I love this story. And the king of Israel looks at the note. He looks at Naaman. He looks at all of the payment that he's brought, and he goes, what? I can't cure this guy. Is this king just trying to pick a fight with me? And it's okay. The servant girl has come along, says, no, it's not you we're asking for help from. Can we go to Elisha? Oh, so the king says, fine, go to Elisha. And Naaman presents himself in Elisha's little town. And Elisha doesn't even come out to see Naaman. He sends a message. He says, go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Well, the Jordan River is a muddy stream. And Naaman is offended. Well, I thought if I came, you would come out and you would raise your hands over me and do a proper healing. And instead, it's just this. And he was angry. He was going to head back for home. And that little Israelite slave girl says, now, wait a minute. If the prophet had asked you to do something really difficult for a healing, wouldn't you have done it? Why don't you just do this simple thing and see what happens? And so Naaman is convinced, and he washes in the Jordan, and he's clean, his skin pure again. There's more to that story, but you have to read it. It's quite a story. So, that's what Jesus referred to. And in just those couple of sentences, people saw these stories unfold before them. And Jesus says, Yeah, don't you think there were lepers in Israel? But Elisha cured the enemy. It's interesting, there's good news in both of these stories, right? A woman and her son are saved from starvation. A man is cured of leprosy, but there's also bad news. Because they were both foreigners, and in fact, one was even an enemy. So Jesus is saying, we don't have a corner on God's care or action in our lives. The good people of Nazareth were deeply offended by this. They were God's chosen people, right? So God took care of them first. As I thought about this, I thought, okay, how much different are we than those people of Nazareth? How easy is it for us to hear that kind of message? So, good and faithful people of grace and peace. You, whose love for God is shown in your faithful worship and in your support, financial, time, talent, treasure in this congregation. You, who have made and served countless meals in your lovely kitchen. You, who have taught classes and planned worship and rehearsed music. You, who have responded so generously to the needs of people in Peoria. You, who've served on council, who served on the call committee. Look around. Look around at what's going on all around you. God's blessing is falling abundantly on people who are not members of any Lutheran congregation in town, who are not American, who aren't even Christian. We have no exclusive rights to God's favor or blessing. Frankly, this chills my parochial soul. Of course I want to be God's favorite. To hear otherwise is not good news. To hear it from Jesus is devastating. The people of Nazareth were wounded, cut to the quick, angry, and then enraged. How dare this hometown guy tell us that we are not God's favorites? That's what keeps us going. That's what gets us up in the morning. And in their rage, they're ready to shut Jesus up permanently. So they hustle him to a cliff outside of town, ready to throw him off. And the gospel reading ends. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. Now, I've heard this interpreted as Jesus simply remained calm in the face of their anger, that his majestic bearing took him out of this dangerous situation. But I think to say that is to miss something that Luke wants us to remember. Because Jesus has very recently returned from his time in the wilderness. And in that time, he was tempted. The last temptation that Satan presents to him is this. He suggests that Jesus should test God's protection of him by throwing himself off the pinnacle of the temple. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to test God. But here, not 20 verses after that test, God is protecting Jesus from being thrown off a cliff. The Father has arranged Jesus' schedule. He has a lot more work to do. And nobody, not even an angry, murderous crowd, is going to rush God's timing. Those angels sent to protect Jesus were with him. So, what does this living word have to say to us today? Well, one thing it says is that God may speak to us most directly, and we may hear God most effectively when he makes us angry. When he says things that make us question who we are in relation to God. Are we the chosen, the favored, the blessed? Yes, we are. God is with us. He cares for us. He heals us. He loves us. And God also works equally in the lives of people who live and worship very differently from us. We don't have a corner on God's love and protection. Through Jesus' life and death and resurrection, God cares for and heals and saves everyone. We don't have exclusive rights. Being Lutheran, being Christian, being American doesn't give us dibs on God's attention. But there is good news for us in that too. Because what it says is that nothing we've done, none of our efforts, not who we are, none of that has anything to do with God's love for us. It was always a gift we did nothing at all to deserve. And God's continued presence and care and love for us doesn't depend on any of the ways that we identify ourselves. It's God's decision, beginning to end. It's all God's grace. And that's good news for all of us. Amen.